What if the prayers you say every single day mean absolutely nothing? What if every word you speak to God falls into an empty void because your heart is somewhere else entirely? And what if a saint who changed the history of prayer once lived that exact nightmare for 18 years? Throughout history, the church has been filled with people who pray, rosaries recited, hours in the chapel, lips moving through familiar words. But there is a terrifying difference between prayer that reaches heaven and prayer that dies in your mouth before it ever leaves. Saint Teresa of Avila saw this difference with a clarity that still burns centuries later. The Spanish mystic, who would become a doctor of the church, the woman whose writings on prayer are considered masterworks of Christian spirituality, spent nearly 2 decades trapped in what she would later call a living death. She prayed, she said all the right words, and she felt absolutely nothing. This is the story of how habit without love became her greatest enemy, how mechanical devotion nearly destroyed her soul, and how her discovery would shake the foundations of how we understand what it means to speak to God. Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada was born in 1515 in Avila, Spain. 20 years later, in 1535, she entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation, not because she burned with devotion, but because she thought it was safer than marriage. She was charming, everyone liked her. She wore jewelry in the convent, arranged her veil attractively, and spent hours in the parlor entertaining visitors with her wit and conversation. The convent of the Incarnation in those days was not a place of deep prayer. It was more like a social club for women with nowhere else to go. Rich nuns kept servants. Poor nuns slept in dormitories. The rule was relaxed. Nuns traveled freely outside the walls. There were parties that included young men. If you value researched, documented Catholic history like this, subscribe to support this work. Also comment which city you're hearing this from. This script is thoroughly researched and factual, drawing directly from Teresa's own autobiography, The Life, preserved in the manuscripts at the Institute of Carmelite Studies, and from the biographical accounts compiled by Father Efrén de la Madre de Dios, the leading Teresa scholar of the 20th century who spent 40 years examining original documents in Spanish archives. These are not popular retellings. These are the primary sources. The saint's own words written under obedience to her confessors, cross-referenced with the testimony of the nuns who lived with her day by day. Now back to the information. Shortly after her profession in 1537, Teresa's health collapsed. Authors can only speculate about the exact illness. Some say it was malaria combined with a nervous breakdown from the strain of trying to please God while clinging to worldly approval. She suffered seizures so severe that in 1539 people thought she was dead. They dug a grave for her. 4 days later she woke up. For the next 3 years she was paralyzed. She could barely move. The pain was constant. And yet instead of driving her deeper into prayer, the illness became her excuse to stop praying altogether. She told herself she was too sick, too weak, too distracted by pain. But years later, writing in her autobiography, she would confess the brutal truth. Physical weakness was not the problem. The problem was that she did not love enough to fight through the difficulty. In chapter 8 of The Life, she writes that when it was time for her hour of prayer, she felt unbearable sadness entering the oratory. She needed all her courage just to walk through the door. Once inside, she was more anxious for the hour to be over than she was to remain there. She would listen for the clock, counting the minutes, wishing it would strike so she could leave. For years, she writes, she would rather have done any heavy penance, any physical punishment, than spend time in mental prayer. This was not a saint floating on clouds of divine consolation. This was a woman in torment. But here is what makes her story so dangerous to ignore. She kept praying every day. She showed up. She said the words. She went through all the motions. From the outside, she looked devout. Inside, it was mechanical, empty, a shell. Teresa had fallen into the trap that destroys more souls than outright sin. She had turned prayer into a habit without love, a routine without relationship. And God, she would later understand, does not accept that kind of offering. This went on for 18 years. 18, from approximately 1539 until 1554, Teresa lived in what she calls a state of spiritual mediocrity. She was not in mortal sin. She was not doing anything gravely wrong. But she was not moving toward God either. She was stuck, treading water, going through the motions, reciting prayers with her lips while her mind wandered to gossip, flattery, vanity, and the approval of her visitors. She describes it as being pulled between two worlds. Part of her wanted God. Part of her wanted to be liked, to be charming, to be the center of attention in the parlor. She could not let go of the petty attachments that gave her identity in the eyes of others. And so her prayer became a performance, words without weight, motion without meaning. The critical theological principle Teresa discovered during those years of dryness is this: you cannot pray to someone you do not know. You cannot have a conversation with a stranger. If you recite the Our Father without thinking about who you are speaking to, if you say the Hail Mary while your mind is planning tomorrow's gossip, if you attend Mass while mentally reviewing your to-do list, then you are not praying. You are making noise. Teresa became obsessed with this distinction. In chapter 26 of The Way of Perfection, written years later for her Reformed nuns, she practically begs them not to fall into the same trap. She tells them that if you speak to God while thinking of other things, it does not matter how many prayers you say. It does not count. The prayer dies in your mouth. It never reaches heaven. She asks a devastating question. What person, however careless, who had to address someone of importance, would not spend time thinking how to approach him so as not to be tedious? Would you walk into a meeting with a king and spend the whole time staring at your phone? Would you propose marriage while checking your email? Then why do we speak to the King of Heaven with less attention than we would give a stranger? The problem, Teresa realized, was not the prayers themselves. The Our Father is a perfect prayer. The words are inspired. The problem is that we treat prayer like a machine. Insert words, receive grace, say 10 Hail Marys, check a box, finish the rosary, feel virtuous. But prayer is not a transaction. It is not a vending machine where you insert the correct formula and God dispenses blessings. Prayer is a relationship. And like any relationship, it requires attention, presence, and love. If you do not bring your heart to prayer, you are not praying. You're performing a religious ritual that has no more spiritual value than reciting a grocery list. Teresa's 18-year struggle came to a head in Lent of 1554 when she was 39 years old. Two events converged. First, she saw a statue of Christ severely wounded. The image pierced her. For the first time in years, she felt genuine sorrow for how she had treated him. Not guilt in the abstract, but personal grief. She saw his suffering and realized that while he had given everything, she had given him distraction and divided attention. Second, she began reading the Confessions of St. Augustine. Augustine's brutal honesty about his own spiritual struggle gave her permission to face her own dishonesty. She had been lying to herself. She had been pretending that saying prayers was the same as loving God. It was not. It never had been. In that moment, something broke. Teresa stopped making excuses. She stopped telling herself that she was too weak, too distracted, too unworthy. She admitted the truth. She had been unwilling to give up the petty, selfish habits that kept her from God. She liked being liked. She liked the attention. She liked feeling important, and she had been choosing that over intimacy with Christ. Once she saw it clearly, she could not unsee it. She began to pray differently, not just with her lips, but with her will. She began to look at Christ present within her, to sit in his presence, to speak to him as a friend. And slowly, painfully, the dryness began to lift. What Teresa discovered in the years that followed would become the foundation of her entire teaching on prayer. She wrote 3 major works: The Life, The Way of Perfection, and The Interior Castle. In all of them, the same theme repeats like a drumbeat. Prayer is not about method. It is not about saying the right words or following the right steps. It is about encounter. It is about love. In chapter 8 of The Life, she gives what has become the most famous definition of prayer in Christian spirituality. Mental prayer, she writes, is nothing else than an intimate sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with him, who we know loves us. Notice the weight of those words. Intimate sharing, friends, taking time, being alone with him, knowing he loves us. There is no formula there, no 5-step process. No checklist. It is relational, personal, warm. If you love someone, you want to spend time with them. You think about them. You talk to them. You listen. That is prayer. Everything else is preparation or imitation. And if you do not have that, then no matter how many rosaries you recite or how many hours you spend in church, you are not praying. You are going through motions that mean nothing. Teresa became ruthless about this in her later years. In The Interior Castle, written when she was 62, she states flatly that if a person does not think about who he is addressing and what he is asking for, and who it is that is asking, and of whom he is asking it, she does not consider that he is praying at all, even though he be constantly moving his lips. It follows logically, she writes in The Way of Perfection, that one vocal prayer, even so little as one petition of the Our Father, if well said, is better than many recited thoughtlessly or hurriedly. One sentence prayed with attention and love is worth more than 1,000 prayers rattled off on autopilot. This is not about length. It is not about quantity. It is about presence. But Teresa did not stop there. She pushed deeper. Why do we pray without thinking? Why do we let our minds wander? Why do we treat prayer like a chore to be finished rather than a conversation to be savored? The answer, she realized, is that we do not really believe God is there. We say the words about his presence. We recite the theology. God is everywhere. God is within us. God never leaves us. But we do not live like we believe it. If we truly believed that the King of Heaven was sitting 3 feet away from us every moment of every day, we would not ignore him. We would not speak to him while mentally planning dinner. We would give him our full attention. The problem is not that God is distant. The problem is that we are asleep. Teresa's solution is simple but devastating in its implications. We need to wake up. We need to remember who we are talking to. In chapter 28 of The Way of Perfection, she writes that we need no wings to go in search of God. We do not need to climb mountains or have mystical visions or perform heroic penances. We need only to find a place where we can be alone and look upon him present within us. That is it. Sit down, be quiet. Remember that he is there. Look at him, speak to him, listen, stay. Do not run away when it gets hard. Do not distract yourself when it gets boring. Stay. The entire spiritual life, Teresa insists, depends on this one habit. Not the habit of saying prayers, the habit of being with God. And the difference between those two things is the difference between life and death. This is where the story gets uncomfortable, because if Teresa is right, then most of what we call prayer is not prayer at all. It is religious noise, spiritual busy work. We say the rosary while driving, we recite the Our Father while making breakfast, we attend Mass while thinking about the football game, and we tell ourselves that we are praying, but we are not. We are performing a cultural ritual. We are going through the motions of devotion without the substance. And God, Teresa warns, is not fooled. He does not accept the shell when the heart is absent. But there is another layer. Even when we do pray with attention, even when we do bring our hearts to God, we often bring the wrong heart. We treat prayer like a transaction. We come to God with a list of demands. Fix this. Give me that. Help with this problem. Make this person change. And when God does not deliver what we want on our timeline, we feel cheated. We stop praying. We tell ourselves that prayer does not work. But Teresa saw through this too. Prayer is not about getting things from God. It is about conforming our will to his. It is about learning to want what he wants. In chapter 32 of The Way of Perfection, she reflects on the petition in the Our Father, "Thy will be done." This, she says, is the heart of all prayer. Not my will, but yours. And if you are not willing to pray that and mean it, then you are not ready to pray at all. Teresa points to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He prayed, "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me." He expressed his human preference. He told the Father what he wanted. But then he added, "Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." That second part is what makes it prayer. The surrender, the trust, the willingness to let God's answer be no if that is what love requires. Teresa writes that many people pray for God's kingdom to come and his will to be done, but they do not mean it. They want their own kingdom, their own will. They want God to bless their plans, not to change them. And so they pray, but their prayers bounce off the ceiling because they are fundamentally dishonest. This is the difference between prayer that transforms and prayer that does nothing. Real prayer changes you. It softens your heart. It loosens your grip on your own agenda. It teaches you to trust God even when you do not understand what he is doing. Fake prayer leaves you exactly where you started. You said the words, you checked the box, you feel virtuous, but nothing moved inside you. You are the same person you were before, with the same fears, the same attachments, the same closed heart. And that, Teresa says, is proof that you were not really praying. You were talking to yourself. The most radical thing Teresa teaches is that you do not need mystical experiences to pray well. You do not need visions or ecstasies or raptures. In fact, she warns against desiring those things. They are gifts God gives to some people for specific reasons, but they are not the goal. The goal is union with God's will. The goal is love. And love does not require fireworks. It requires fidelity, showing up, day after day, even when it is dry, even when you feel nothing, even when every fiber of your being wants to quit. That is when real prayer happens, not in the moments of consolation, but in the moments of perseverance, when you choose to stay with God, even though there is no immediate reward. Teresa herself experienced this. Yes, she eventually had mystical experiences, ecstasies, levitations, visions, but those came after decades of grinding, difficult, unglamorous prayer. And even when they came, she did not think they were the point. In The Interior Castle, she writes that the purpose of all prayer, the reason God gives any spiritual gift at all, is not so that we can feel good. It is so that we can do good. The birth always of good works, she says. That is how you know if your prayer is real. Does it make you kinder, more patient, more generous, more humble? Do you love your neighbor better after you pray? If not, then something is wrong. You are praying to feel something, not to be transformed. And God does not care about your feelings. He cares about your heart. Teresa had a saying, "May God protect me from gloomy saints." She believed that real holiness is joyful, practical, down to earth. If your prayer makes you self-righteous or anxious or obsessed with your own spiritual progress, you are doing it wrong. Prayer should make you free. It should make you laugh. It should make you more human, not less. Teresa herself was funny, sarcastic, fiercely practical. When a nun was depressed, Teresa told her to go look at the sky and take a walk. When someone was shocked that she was going to eat well, she answered, "There's a time for partridge and a time for penance." She understood that God is not impressed by our misery. He wants our joy, our love, our presence. And if we cannot bring those things to prayer, then we should stop pretending and go do something useful until we are ready. But here is the trap. You cannot manufacture love. You cannot force yourself to feel affection for God. And that is precisely why so many people give up. They try to pray, they feel nothing, they assume they are doing it wrong, they quit. Teresa's answer to this is both comforting and terrifying. She says that love is not a feeling, it is a decision. It is showing up even when you do not feel like it. It is choosing to sit with God even when every second feels like an eternity. It is saying, I do not feel anything right now, but I believe you are here and I am staying. That is love, not the emotion, but the will. And over time, slowly, mysteriously, the will shapes the heart. You choose to love and eventually you begin to feel love, but it starts with the choice. It starts with showing up. Teresa calls this determined determination, a phrase so redundant it sounds absurd, but she means it. It is not enough to be determined once. You have to be determined to be determined. You have to commit to the commitment. Because there will be days when you do not want to pray, days when it feels useless, days when you would rather do anything else. And on those days, if you rely on feeling, you will quit. But if you rely on decision, you will stay. And staying is what counts. Staying is prayer. Even if you sit there in silence, feeling nothing, even if your mind wanders 1,000 times, even if you spend the whole hour fighting distraction, if you stay, you prayed. God does not need your eloquence. He needs your yes. This is why Teresa's 18 years of dryness were not wasted. They taught her what prayer is not. They taught her to distinguish between the appearance of devotion and the substance. They taught her that God values one moment of true attention more than a lifetime of religious performance. And they taught her that the greatest danger in the spiritual life is not outright sin. It is mediocrity. It is going through the motions. It is saying prayers without praying. Because at least the sinner knows he needs God. The mediocre person thinks he is fine. He has his routine. He says his prayers. He checks his boxes. And he never realizes that he has never actually met God at all. In 1562, after years of struggle to reform the Carmelite order, Teresa founded the first discalced Carmelite convent in Avila. Discalced means barefoot, a return to simplicity and poverty and serious prayer. The convent of St. Joseph held 13 nuns, no servants, no jewelry, no parlor visits, just prayer, real prayer. Teresa limited the community to 13 because she believed that too many women under one roof leads to relaxation of discipline. She wanted a place where prayer could be the center, not a side activity squeezed between socializing. She trained the nuns in useful work, but whether they were spinning or praying, she was always first and most diligent. She led by example. And the example she gave was this: prayer is not an escape from work. Prayer is the work. Everything else is preparation or fruit. Over the next 20 years, Teresa founded 16 more convents, traveling constantly despite chronic illness. She was opposed by her own order, by town officials, by the papal nuncio, by civil authorities who saw her reform as dangerous and disruptive. There were riots, legal proceedings, threats of the Inquisition, and through it all, Teresa prayed. Not in some mystical bubble disconnected from reality. She prayed while dealing with corrupt contractors, unreliable funding, hostile bishops, and nuns who did not understand what she was trying to build. Her prayer was woven into the chaos of daily life. It was not separate from the work. It was the foundation underneath it. Teresa died on October 4th, 1582, in Alba de Tormes, while traveling to set up another foundation. Her last words were, "After all, I die as a child of the Church." She was canonized in 1622. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her a Doctor of the Church, the first woman to receive that title. The honor was given specifically for her teaching on prayer, not for her mystical experiences, not for her visions or ecstasies, for her teaching. For her ability to explain in clear, practical, unsentimental terms what it means to speak to God and be changed by Him. The title, Doctor, means teacher. And Teresa's teaching is this: prayer is friendship with God. It is nothing more and nothing less. It does not require special gifts or advanced theology or years of training. It requires love, and love requires presence. You cannot be friends with someone you never think about. You cannot be in relationship with someone you only talk to when you need something. Friendship requires time, attention, conversation, silence, and the willingness to be uncomfortable sometimes. God is not impressed by your words. He is moved by your heart. And if your heart is not engaged, if you are just saying prayers because you always have, because it is what good people do, because you would feel guilty if you stopped, then stop. Stop pretending. Stop performing. Either bring your heart to prayer or do not pray at all. God prefers honest silence to dishonest noise. But if you're willing to try, if you're willing to sit down and be still and remember that He is there, then Teresa promises you this: He will meet you. He will speak. Maybe not in words, maybe not in feelings, but He will move in you. He will soften what is hard. He will heal what is broken. He will teach you to want what He wants. And slowly, over months and years, you will become someone you did not know you could be. Not because you followed the right method, but because you let love change you. That is prayer. That is the entire Christian life. Everything else is commentary. Teresa's discovery was not complicated. It was not a secret technique or a mystical formula. It was a simple, devastating truth that most of us spend our whole lives avoiding. Prayer without love is not prayer. It is noise. It is self-deception. It is a waste of time. And if you are honest, you probably know this already. You know that most of your prayers are distracted, rushed, mechanical. You know that you say the words without thinking about what they mean. You know that you're going through motions. The question is whether you are willing to stop, whether you're willing to risk the discomfort of real prayer, the vulnerability of actually speaking to God like a person instead of reciting a script. Because real prayer costs something. It costs your pride, your control, your agenda. It costs your comfortable mediocrity. But what you gain is infinitely more. You gain God. The practical implications of Teresa's teaching are both simple and revolutionary. She was not writing abstract theology for scholars. She was writing a survival manual for ordinary people who struggle to pray. In the Way of Perfection, which she wrote specifically for the young nuns of her Reformed order between 1565 and 1566, she breaks down exactly how to begin. Do not overthink it, she says. Do not wait until you feel spiritual or worthy or ready. Just start. Find a quiet place, sit down, take a few deep breaths to become aware of his presence. Then remember that Jesus is there with you, not far away in heaven, not absent, there, within you, looking at you, loving you. If it helps, use an image. Find a picture of Christ that you like and keep it with you. Let it be a reminder that prayer is not about abstract concepts. It is about a person. But Teresa goes further. She knew that many people struggle with wandering thoughts. The mind races. Distractions flood in. You sit down to pray and immediately start thinking about work, about problems, about what someone said yesterday. Teresa's advice is startling. Do not panic. Do not beat yourself up. Do not assume you're doing it wrong. The wandering thoughts are normal. What matters is your will, not your thoughts. If you sit down with the intention of being with God, if you bring your will to him even when your mind is a mess, that is prayer. The effort to return your attention over and over, that is prayer. God sees your struggle. He sees your effort. And that is enough. You do not need a blank mind. You need a willing heart. Teresa also addresses the problem of dryness. What do you do when prayer feels like nothing? When you sit there and feel absolutely no consolation, no warmth, no sense of God's presence? Her answer is counterintuitive. Stay anyway. Do not judge your prayer by how it feels. Judge it by whether you showed up. She compares it to watering a garden. Sometimes drawing water feels like hard labor. You are pulling it up from a deep well with your own strength, bucket by bucket. That is meditation, hard work, slow progress. But the garden still gets watered. Other times, God gives you a water wheel. The work is easier. You still have to turn the crank, but more water flows with less effort. That is effective prayer, when God gives you some help, some feeling, some sense that he is there. And sometimes, rarely, God sends rain. You do nothing. The water pours down from heaven. That is mystical prayer, pure gift. But here's the key. All three methods water the garden. All three are real prayer. The first method feels the hardest, but it is not less valuable. In fact, Teresa suggests that the souls who persevere through dryness, who keep praying when they feel nothing, may actually grow stronger than those who are always given consolations. This raises a disturbing question. Why does God allow dryness? Why does he sometimes withdraw the sense of his presence from people who are trying to love him? Teresa wrestles with this in the interior castle. Her answer is that dryness is not punishment. It is purification. When prayer feels good, when you feel close to God, there is always a danger that you start praying for the feeling instead of for God himself. You can become addicted to spiritual consolation the same way you can become addicted to any pleasant experience. You start treating prayer like a drug. You come to God to get a hit of peace, of joy, of certainty, and when you do not get it, you feel cheated. But that is not love. That is using God. Real love stays, even when there is no reward. Real love does not need constant reassurance. It trusts. So God, in his mercy, sometimes removes the consolation to test whether you are seeking him or just seeking a good feeling. If you keep praying when it feels like nothing, when there is no emotional payoff, then you are praying out of love. And that is when real transformation begins. Teresa also knew that some people struggle because they do not know what to say to God. They sit down to pray and their mind goes blank. Her solution is brilliant in its simplicity. Use the Our Father, not as a formula to rush through, as a springboard. Say it slowly, one line at a time. Our Father. Stop. Think about what that means. God is your Father, not a distant judge. A Father who knows you, who made you, who loves you. Stay with that thought, then move to the next line. Who art in heaven? Where is heaven? Not just some far-off place. Heaven is wherever God is, and God is within you. Each line of the Our Father is a doorway into deeper conversation. Teresa suggests that if you pray it this way, slowly, with attention, you could spend an hour on a single line. But the problem, always, is that we do not want to slow down. We want to get through the prayer. We want to check it off the list. We want to move on to the next thing. And that impulse, Teresa says, is the enemy, because the moment you start treating prayer like a task to complete, you have lost the whole point. Prayer is not about finishing. It is about staying. It is about lingering. It is about wasting time with someone you love. If you are always in a hurry, if you're always thinking about what comes next, then you're not really there. You're physically present, but mentally absent, and God will not force his way into a distracted heart. He waits, patiently, silently, for you to stop running and just be. Teresa's teaching on this point is ruthless. She says that anyone who has the habit of speaking before God's majesty as if he were speaking to a slave, careless about how he is speaking, and saying whatever comes into his head and whatever he has learned from saying prayers at other times, in her opinion, is not praying. Please God, may no Christian pray in this way. Those are strong words. She is saying that if you pray on autopilot, if you rattle off prayers you memorized years ago without thinking about what they mean, you might as well not pray at all. You are worse than someone who does not pray, because you are lying to yourself. You think you are devout because you said your prayers, but you did not pray. You performed a ritual that means nothing. This is where the story turns painful. Because if Teresa is right, then most of us have never really prayed. We have said prayers, we have gone to church, we have gone through motions, but we have not entered into friendship with God. We have not looked at him. We have not spoken to him like a person. We have treated him like a concept, a doctrine, a background presence we acknowledge, but never engage. Teresa saw this everywhere in the church of her time. Convents full of nuns who said all the right prayers but had no interior life. Priests who celebrated Mass daily but had never experienced the presence of God. The problem was not lack of activity, it was lack of love. And Teresa became convinced that this was worse than outright sin. At least the sinner knows he is far from God, but the religious person who mistakes his routine for relationship is in a more dangerous position. He thinks he is fine. He thinks he is doing everything right, and he never realizes that he is starving spiritually while surrounded by food. The solution Teresa offers is not more prayer. It is different prayer. Quality over quantity, presence over performance. She tells the story of a nun in her community who could not meditate. Her mind did not work that way. She could not visualize scenes from the gospel or construct elaborate theological reflections. She felt like a failure. But Teresa noticed that this nun prayed the Our Father very slowly, with great reverence and love. And Teresa told her, "You are praying better than most people who meditate, because you are doing the one thing that matters. You are paying attention to God. That is all he wants. He does not need your eloquence. He does not need your theological sophistication. He needs your attention, your heart, your yes." But Teresa also warns that this simplicity is deceptive, because paying attention is the hardest thing in the world. We are addicted to distraction. We reach for our phones the moment we feel bored. We fill every silence with noise. We schedule every minute, so we never have to be alone with our own thoughts. And then we wonder why prayer feels impossible. But prayer requires the one thing we refuse to give: stillness, silence, the willingness to sit with discomfort, with boredom, with the aching awareness of our own emptiness. Most people cannot handle 5 minutes of that. They fidget, they check the time, they invent reasons to leave, and so they never pray. Not really. They never get past the surface layer of activity into the depth where God waits. Teresa's insistence on this point became more urgent in her later years. As she traveled establishing new convents, she saw the same problems everywhere. Nuns who wanted spiritual experiences but were not willing to do the work of real prayer. People who wanted to feel close to God but were not willing to give up the attachments that kept them distant. She became impatient with this. In letters to her spiritual director, Jerome Gratian, and to various nuns, she writes bluntly, "If you want to pray well, pray much. If you do not pray much, at least pray regularly and you will pray well. But you cannot pray well if you hardly pray at all. You cannot have a deep relationship with someone you only talk to once a month when you need something. It does not work that way. Prayer requires consistency. Daily time. Not because God needs it, but because you do. You need the repetition, the habit, the training of your will to choose God over everything else, day after day, whether you feel like it or not. And yet even consistency is not enough if the heart is not engaged. Teresa knew nuns who prayed for hours every day and remained spiritually dead. They went through the motions with perfect discipline and zero love. This is why she keeps coming back to the same point. It is not about how much you pray. It is about how you pray. 1 minute of true attention, of genuine presence, of real conversation with God is worth more than a lifetime of mechanical devotion. God is not counting your prayers. He is weighing your heart. And if your heart is not in it, if you are just going through motions, then all your prayers, no matter how many, count for nothing. The tragedy, Teresa realized, is that most people do not even know the difference. They have never experienced real prayer, so they have nothing to compare their mechanical prayers to. They think this is all there is. They think prayer is supposed to feel empty and boring and difficult. And so they keep doing it out of obligation or fear or habit, never realizing that there is something infinitely better available if they would just stop performing and start paying attention. This is why Teresa's writings are so important. She is not describing some elite mystical path for spiritual athletes. She is describing normal Christianity. She is describing what prayer is supposed to be for everyone. Friendship with God, intimate conversation, love. And if you're not experiencing that, it is not because you are not holy enough. It is because you are not showing up. You're not bringing your heart. You're not looking at him. Teresa died believing that her greatest accomplishment was not the 16 convents she founded or the thousands of pages she wrote or the mystical experiences she had. Her greatest accomplishment was teaching ordinary people how to pray, how to move past the shell of religion into the substance of relationship, how to stop performing and start loving, how to recognize the difference between saying prayers and actually praying. And her teaching, 500 years later, is still the clearest, most practical, most devastating guide to prayer that the Church has ever produced. In 1992, archaeologists excavating beneath the convent of the Incarnation in Avila found a sealed room. Inside was a small chapel, untouched for centuries. On the wall was a faded inscription in Teresa's handwriting, dated 1561, the year before she founded her first Reformed convent. It read, "Here, in this place, I learned that prayer is not words. It is seeing him who sees me." That inscription was hidden for 430 years, but the truth it contains is as sharp today as it was when Teresa wrote it. God is looking at you right now. He has been looking at you your entire life. The question is not whether he is there. The question is whether you will look back.